Almost every city on earth keeps its funeral fires at the edge of town. Varanasi built its heart around them, on one stone terrace above the Ganges. Funeral pyres burn day and night, and tradition holds that the flame has been passed from fire to fire for thousands of years. Whether or not that is literally true, this much is documented. People were living beside this bend of the river before Rome became a city, and centuries before the Buddha was born. When the American writer Mark Twain visited in 1896, he said the place looked older than history itself, older than legend, older than anything else he could name. He saw India through the assumptions of his era. About this place, he may have seen clearly. This is the story of the oldest living city of the Hindu world, and it holds a secret that almost nobody who photographs it understands. By the end of this journey, you will know why the holiest temple in this eternal city was built after the American Declaration of Independence, and why that fact, strangely, is the proof of its greatness. The river remembers all of it. Let us go down to the water. Chapter 1. The river before the city. Start with the river, because everything here starts with the river. The Ganges is born in the ice of the Himalayas and spends most of its journey flowing south and east, down across the great plains of northern India toward the Bay of Bengal. But at one place, and almost nowhere else along its entire course, the river bends and flows north, toward the mountains it came from, toward, in the Hindu imagination, its own source. That place is Varanasi. To the people who would eventually build their theology on this riverbank, that northward turn was no accident. Rivers do not flow backward toward heaven unless something sacred is happening. But set the theology aside for a moment and look at the land the way the first settlers would have looked at it, because the geography alone explains almost everything. On the western side of that northward bend, the ground rises. A long crescent of high bank stands well above the water, a natural terrace of firm ground in a floodplain that drowns every summer. When the monsoon comes and the Ganges swells, sometimes rising by dozens of feet, the far bank across the river disappears under water. It is a wall of sand and silt, rebuilt and erased year after year. To this day, if you stand on the Ghats and look across the river, you see almost nothing on the far side. No Templars, no houses, no city, thousands of years of civilization on one bank, and emptiness on the other. The river made that decision, not the people. So the first settlers took the high western ground. Who were they? Here is where this story has to slow down and be honest with you, because two very different answers exist, and they do not agree. The first answer comes from the shovel. In the 1950s and 60s, archaeologists from Benares Hindu University, led by the scholar A.K. Narayan, began excavating a raised area in the northern part of the modern city called the Rajhat Plateau, near where a small river called the Varana meets the Ganges. What they found, layer by layer, was the debris of ordinary life: pottery, floors, post holes, the traces of wooden houses. The strongest evidence at Rajghat reaches back roughly 3,000 years, to somewhere around 800 BC. Some archaeologists, pointing to nearby sites, including a mound called Aktha, argue that settlement in the wider area began several centuries earlier still. Those earlier claims are debated among specialists, and the sequence has gaps that honest scholars admit rather than paper over. So let us say it carefully, and then move on. This riverbank has held people for about 3 millennia, and possibly longer. And the argument is about the possibly. Either way, hold on to what that number means. When those first mud and timber houses went up above the Ganges, Rome did not exist. Athens was a minor town. The Buddha would not be born for centuries. Among the cities alive on earth today, only a small number, places like Jerusalem and Damascus, can point to comparably deep histories of settlement bound to sacred meaning. This riverbank belongs to that tiny club, and it may be the only member where the original reason for the sanctity, the river itself, still flows past the front steps. The second answer comes from faith, and it is much grander. In Hindu tradition, Varanasi was not founded by anyone. It is the city of Shiva, one of the supreme gods of Hinduism, the lord of destruction and transformation, the Puranas, the great body of Hindu sacred literature written down many centuries later, describe this city as the first ground ever created, the fixed point from which the rest of the universe unfolded. One tradition holds that the city stands on the point of Shiva's trident, lifted above the earth, which is why believers say it can never truly be destroyed. Pilgrims do not come here because the city is old. They come because, in their understanding, the city is outside of time altogether. Now, a careful storyteller does not ask you to choose between the trench and the trident. Archaeology tells you when people arrived. Scripture tells you why they stayed, and why they kept coming back after every fire, every flood, every conquest. Both answers are doing real work in this story. You just have to know which kind of truth each one is telling. The names themselves carry the history. The oldest is Kashi, which appears in some of the later Vedic texts, and which tradition connects to a Sanskrit root meaning to shine, the city of light. The name Varanasi, according to the most widely repeated explanation, comes from geography. The stretch of bank between two small rivers, the Varana to the north and the Asi to the south, both of which still trickle into the Ganges today. Local speech shortened and softened the name into forms like Benares, and under British rule the spelling Benares became standard in English, the name the world knew for about 200 years. These names never replaced one another neatly. They overlapped, and they still do, each carrying the memory of a different language, a different community, a different administration. Ask for the city by any of them today, and someone will know what you mean. And here is the detail worth carrying with you for the rest of this story, because it is the key to everything that follows. Of those first centuries, almost nothing physical survives above ground. The wooden houses rotted, the mud walls dissolved back into the plain. The early shrines, whatever they looked like, are gone. Nearly every temple, every palace, every one of the great stone stairways to the water that you see in photographs of Varanasi today was built in roughly the last 300 years. We will get to why. And the why involves armies, hammers, and one remarkable queen. The stones of the eternal city are, by the standards of this story, practically new. So what, exactly, is 3,000 years old here? Not the buildings, the behavior. Somewhere in those early centuries, people began walking down this particular slope of riverbank at dawn, stepping into this particular water, and speaking to something larger than themselves. Empires would rise around that simple act and collapse around it. The language of the prayers would change. The gods being addressed would change. The city would burn and drown and be rebuilt in new shapes by new rulers. No historian can certify every morning of 3,000 years. And this story will not pretend to. What the record shows is something in its way more impressive. Every time the practice was interrupted, bivar, by flood, by conquest, it came back. The city is not a place where nothing ever stopped. It is a place where nothing ever stayed stopped. By around the 8th century BC, the settlement above the Varana was no longer just a cluster of houses on high ground. It was becoming a town with a name that traders and priests spoke along the length of the great river. And in the centuries that followed, that town would find itself at the center of one of the most explosive periods of thought in human history. An age when kings competed for it. Philosophers argued in it, and ideas took shape along this river that today live inside more than 1 billion people. That is where we go next, to the kingdom called Kashi, and to the age when this muddy riverbank started talking about the soul. Chapter 2. The Kingdom of Kashi. Between roughly the 8th and 6th centuries BC, northern India went through a transformation that historians sometimes call the second urbanization. The first great Indian cities. The cities of the Indus Valley civilization far to the west had risen and vanished more than 1,000 years earlier. Now, along the Ganges plain, cities were being born again. Iron tools were clearing the forests. Rice surpluses were feeding larger populations. Trade routes were stitching the river towns together. And out of that ferment emerged a patchwork of rival states that the ancient texts call the Mahajanapadas. The great realms, Buddhist sources, such as the Anguttara Nikaya. List 16 of them. One of the 16 was Kashi, and its capital was the city on the high bank of the Ganges. We should be honest about the sources here. For this period, there are no royal archives from Kashi, no inscriptions from its kings that survive. What we have are later texts. Vedic, Buddhist, and Jain, which remember Kashi in stories, and the archaeology at Rajghat, which shows the town growing, its pottery becoming finer, its ramparts eventually rising in earth and brick. Piecing those together, a picture forms. And it is a picture of a place already known for 3 things: cloth, kings, and question. Start with the cloth, because it is the most concrete. Ancient Buddhist texts repeatedly associate Kashi with fine textiles, and they use the phrase Kashi cloth almost the way we would use a brand name, shorthand for the best fabric money could buy. The Buddha himself according to one discourse, remarks that his robes before his renunciation were of Kashi cloth, the garments of a pampered prince. One caution before we go on. What exactly that ancient cloth was, and how it was made. The texts do not tell us in detail, and it was not yet the gold-woven Benares brocade the world knows today. That famous fabric would take shape much later, and its story is one of the best in this video. For now, just hold the simple fact, nearly 25 centuries ago, the name of this city already meant quality you could wear. Keep that thread in your hand. Then the kings, the later Vedic texts and the Puranas preserve lists of Kashi rulers, and the Jataka tales, the Buddhist birth stories, are full of a stock figure called Brahmadatta, king of Benares, who appears in hundreds of tales the way once upon a time appears in European fairy tales. Most of this is legend rather than chronicle, and it is safest to say so plainly, but the legends agree with the archaeology on one point. Kashi was worth fighting over. The texts remember long wars between Kashi and its neighbor Kosala, wars that seesawed for generations, and they remember that Kashi eventually lost. Sometime in the 6th or 5th century BC, the kingdom of Kashi was absorbed by Kosala, which was in turn swallowed by the rising empire of Magadha to the east. As an independent state, Kashi lasted perhaps 2 or 3 centuries. As an idea, it was just getting started. Because here is the strange thing, the thing that makes this city different from almost every other ancient capital. Losing its political independence did not diminish Kashi. Political power moved elsewhere, to Rayagriha, to Pataliputra, and Kashi did not fade the way defeated capitals usually fade. It became something arguably more durable than a capital. It became a place you went to think. This is the age of the Upanishads, the philosophical texts composed across northern India in these very centuries, and Kashi and its region sit inside that world. One of the most famous conversations in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad involves Ajatashatru, a king of Kashi, debating the nature of the self with a learned Brahmin, and delivering the uncomfortable lesson that the priest has come to a king to learn wisdom. Whether that exchange happened as written, no one can prove. What the text tells us beyond doubt is how Kashi was seen. It was a stage where the deepest questions were asked, and where social rank did not automatically decide who had the answers. And pause on what those questions were, because this is the part of the story that reaches directly into the modern world, including, perhaps, into your own vocabulary. What is the self? What happens to it at death? Is there a cycle of rebirth? And can anyone escape it? Does the ritual matter, or the understanding behind it? Across the wider intellectual world of the Ganges, plain in these centuries, the world in which Kashi was one bright and busy node, the ideas of karma, of samsara, the wheel of rebirth, and of moksha, liberation from that wheel, took increasingly clear form. If you have ever used the word karma in a sentence, you are borrowing, across a vast distance of time, from the conversations of that plain, and this city became, over the following centuries, the place most identified with the deepest of those ideas. Not just how to live, how to be free. Notice what happened here, because it explains the next 2.5 millennia. In many ancient states, political and sacred authority were closely joined. The temple stood beside the palace, and when the palace fell, the temple's fortunes fell with it. Kashi found another way, stripped of its kings. It leaned into its gods and its teachers, and its economy learned to run on pilgrims, students, and cloth rather than on conquest. That turned out to be a kind of wealth that armies could seize but never quite carry away. Conquerors would take this city again and again in the centuries ahead. What they could not take was the reason people came. So picture Kashi in the late 6th century BC, and let us be clear that we are picturing rather than photographing, because the sources allow no more than that. A city of weavers and priests, recently defeated, intellectually restless, its riverbank busy with seekers, its groves and rest houses outside the walls sheltering wandering philosophers who had dropped out of ordinary life to chase liberation, teachers debating in public, reputations made and destroyed in argument, the air, so to speak, full of dry tinder. And then, one day, along the road from the south, walked a man of about 35 who had recently sat under a tree at Gaya and come to an understanding he believed no one had reached before. He was heading for the outskirts of Kashi, to a deer park where 5 men who knew him were staying. What happened in that deer park is the subject of the next chapter, and it is one of the great turning points in the history of human thought. Chapter 3. The Buddha walks to Sarnath. About 6 miles north of the riverbank, past the edge of the ancient city, there was a grove where deer were left unharmed, a quiet place associated with sages and renouncers. The old texts call it Rishipatana, the place where the sages landed, or the deer park at Isipatana. Today the world knows it as Sarnath. Around the year 528 BC, according to traditional Buddhist chronology, a former prince named Siddhartha Gautama arrived there on foot. Modern scholars argue about the exact dates of his life, some placing his teaching career closer to the middle of the 5th century BC. So it is fair to say the year is uncertain, while the event itself occupies a central and consistently preserved place in early Buddhist tradition. Weeks earlier, at Bodh Gaya, more than 100 miles to the east, he had experienced what Buddhists call awakening. He was now, in the language of his followers, the Buddha, the one who woke up. Why did the Buddha walk toward Kashi? The traditional account, preserved in texts like the Ariyapariyesana Sutta, gives a direct and human answer. He first thought of his 2 former meditation teachers, learned they had died, and then decided to find the 5 companions who had once practiced austerities with him and had abandoned him when he gave up extreme fasting. Those 5 were staying in the deer park outside Kashi. So the reason the texts give is simple. He went where the people he wanted to reach were staying. Historians looking back sometimes add a wider observation, and it is worth hearing as long as we label it honestly as inference rather than as the Buddha's stated motive. The 5 ascetics were near Kashi for the same reason many seekers of that era were drawn there. It was one of the great gathering places of teachers, patrons, students, and debate in northern India. A new teaching that took root in the orbit of Kashi had pathways to spread that a teaching born in a remote village did not. Whatever mix of reasons carried him, the record of the tradition is that he walked the whole way, crossed the Ganges, and entered the neighborhood of the shining city. In the deer park, the 5 companions saw him coming and agreed among themselves to snub him. The texts say the resolution collapsed the moment he arrived. Something in his bearing had changed. They took his bowl, prepared a seat, and listened. What he then delivered is remembered as the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, the discourse that set the wheel of the teaching in motion. In it, he laid out the middle way between indulgence and self-torture, and the 4 noble truths. That life, as ordinarily lived, involves suffering. That suffering has a cause, which is craving, that it can end, and that there is a path to its ending. One of the 5, Kondanna, is said to have understood on the spot. And with that understanding, the Buddhist community, the Sangha, came into existence. In that grove outside Kashi, a small circle of listeners became the seed of what would grow into one of the great world religions. Sit with the irony for a moment, because it is one of the finest in religious history. Here is a city whose very name would become synonymous with Hindu holiness, and one of the most globally consequential events ever associated with it was not a Hindu event. The first sermon of Buddhism was preached in the suburbs of Kashi, and the 2 traditions were not sealed off from each other. They grew up in the same streets, arguing, borrowing, competing for the same patrons and the same pilgrims. And that long argument would shape both of them for 1,000 years. The Buddha himself, the texts suggest, kept a certain wry distance from ritual bathing. In one discourse, he questions whether washing in sacred waters can by itself remove wrongdoing, saying in effect that a pure heart makes every water sacred. Whether or not he had this particular riverbank in mind, the challenge cut at the heart of what the riverbank believed, and it was delivered a walk away from it. Kashi absorbed the critique the way it has absorbed nearly everything else. Without giving up the morning bath, Sarnath itself became holy ground. In the 3rd century BC, the Emperor Ashoka, ruler of nearly all India and Buddhism's greatest royal patron, raised monuments there. His polished sandstone pillar, crowned with 4 lions standing back to back, stood at the site for centuries. The lions survived. And in 1950, the new Republic of India adopted that lion capital from a pillar raised at one of Buddhism's holiest sites. As its official state emblem, it is on Indian passports, currency, and government seals at this moment. Think about what that means. The national symbol of modern India, a country whose population is overwhelmingly Hindu, comes from a pillar, an emperor, planted in the deer park outside Varanasi to honor the Buddha. This city has a habit of ending up at the center of things. Monasteries rose at Sarnath and flourished for more than 1,000 years. And we will return to their fate, because it is bound up with the darkest chapters of this story. But in the city itself, through these same centuries, another kind of golden age was beginning. Kashi was about to become a classroom for a civilization, and its looms were about to clothe its kings. That is next. The city of silk and Sanskrit. Chapter 4. city of silk and Sanskrit. Somewhere around the year 400 AD, give or take a generation. Picture a young man arriving in Kashi with everything he owns tied in a bundle. He has walked for weeks from a town far down the river. His family has saved for years to send him. He is here for one reason. Somewhere in this maze of lanes lives a teacher, a master of grammar or logic or the Vedas, who takes students. The young man will sit in that teacher's courtyard for 10 years, maybe 20, memorizing, reciting, being corrected, until the day he can defend an argument against all comers. Then he will go home carrying the most valuable thing his world knows how to produce: certified knowledge. We are imagining him, and this story owes you that honesty. No diary of such a student survives from this era, but everything around him is drawn from real evidence, from the texts, sculpture, and archaeology of the age, and multiplied by centuries. Students like him are how this city conquered India without an army. For most cities in the ancient world, we tell the next chapter of the story by naming the new king and the new war. For Kashi, from roughly the 3rd century BC to the 6th century AD, the honest summary is stranger. Empires washed over the city like the monsoon flood, and the city barely changed course. The sequence itself is quickly told. Kashi passed into the empire of the Mauryas, the dynasty of Ashoka, whose capital lay downriver at Pataliputra, near modern Patna. When the Mauryas collapsed, around 185 BC, the region fell to the Shungas. Then came centuries of fragmentation, the rise of the Kushan Empire in the north, and finally, in the 4th century AD, the Guptas, under whom northern India experienced what many historians still call its classical age. Through all of it, Kashi was a provincial city. It minted no imperial coins. It commanded no armies. A political history of ancient India could almost skip it. And yet ask a different question. Not who ruled the city, but what the city was for. Then these quiet centuries turn out to be the ones in which Kashi grew into the institution it has been ever since. 2 crafts carried it: learning and cloth, the mind and the loom. Take learning first. Sanskrit, the polished language of ritual and scholarship, was becoming the shared intellectual currency of the subcontinent, and Kashi came to be counted among the places where that currency was minted. There was no single university in the modern sense, no campus with walls. The system, as far as we can reconstruct it, was more intimate and, in its way, more durable. A learned teacher, a pandit, gathered students in his own house or courtyard. Grammar, logic, astronomy, medicine, law, and above all the Vedas and their commentaries, passed from memory to memory. We should be careful with the timeline here. The really detailed evidence for Kashi as the supreme certifying capital of Sanskrit learning comes from later periods. The medieval and early modern centuries, when scholars across India sought, in effect, peer review from the pandits of this one city. And a saying spread that knowledge was not complete until it had been tested in Kashi. How far back that supremacy reaches into the classical age is harder to document. And honest history says so. What we can say is that the pattern, the teacher's courtyard, the traveling student, the reputation of the city as a destination for learning, has roots in this era and kept reasserting itself for well over 1,000 years afterward. And notice why that kind of institution is so hard to kill. Burn a campus and the university dies. But a school made of trained memory, distributed across hundreds of households, rebuilds itself wherever teachers and students meet again. Kashi's university had no address. That fact is about to matter enormously, because armies are coming, and they will destroy nearly everything in this city that has an address. Now, the loom. And let us go inside a workshop, with the same honesty we used for the student. We cannot reconstruct a specific room from this period. What we can do is assemble, from ancient references to weaving and from the long continuity of the craft. A scene the evidence supports, a low room open to a courtyard, a pit dug into the floor where the weaver sits with his legs below the level of the loom, a design still used on this riverbank today. The clack of the shuttle, threads counted, dyed, stretched, and guarded, because good thread is the most expensive thing in the house. Children learning by sitting beside a parent for years before they are allowed to touch the work. The cloth that leaves that room will be sold to a merchant, carried by boat, downriver, or by cart along the roads north, and worn at a court where nobody will ever know the weaver's name. The city stood well positioned for exactly this. At the junction of the Ganges, a highway of goods running toward the sea, and the land routes north toward the mountain passes and the silk roads beyond. But here we must be careful not to draw a line straighter than the evidence allows. The dazzling Benares brocade of today, dense silk patterned with gold and silver thread, is not a Gupta-era product that survived unchanged. It is the result of a long evolution, absorbing new materials, new markets, and above all, new techniques and motifs that arrived in the medieval and Mughal centuries. Think of the ancient reputation as the root, and the famous fabric as a flower that bloomed much later. Both belong to the same plant. The root is what this era grew. Religion, meanwhile, was slowly reorganizing itself around the city. Somewhere in these centuries, and scholars debate the pace, the worship of Shiva rose toward the dominance it has held on this riverbank ever since. The Puranas, taking shape in this era and after, wove Kashi into Shiva's own story, naming it Avimukta, the place never abandoned by the god. Pilgrimage was acquiring structure, with texts prescribing routes, bathing places, and rewards. A process that would keep elaborating for 1,000 years. And the promise that would define the city, the promise that death here brings liberation, was being written into scripture. The city was, so to speak, drafting its own guarantee, clause by clause, century by century. And Buddhism, still there, still strong. At Sarnath, the monasteries grew richer and more beautiful. Under the Guptas, sculptors at Sarnath produced images of the Buddha counted among the supreme achievements of Indian art. serene sandstone figures now scattered through the museums of the world. Hindu and Buddhist Kashi lived side by side, competing for patronage, sharing the same streets and the same river. So the city around the year 500 AD comes to us as a painting assembled from fragments, not a photograph. Steps and landings at the water, mostly earth and timber, some stone. Templars, mostly modest, crowded along the bank, courtyards echoing with recitation. Looms working cloth, whose name travelled farther than most kings. Deer still grazing at Sarnath among painted monasteries. A city, by the rough standards of ancient estimates, of many thousands, that had made itself something rarer than a capital, a place whose product was certainty. The Pandit certified your doctrine, the weaver certified your rank, and even regimes that controlled the city taxed it, or later damaged it, repeatedly found uses for its learning, its pilgrims, and its trade. Every scene in that picture is reconstruction, and reconstruction always involves guesswork, which is why the next chapter matters so much. Because in the 7th century, a traveller arrived in Kashi who did something almost nobody in ancient India did. He wrote down what he saw, at length, with dates, and his notebook survived. Chapter 5. The Chinese Pilgrim's Eyewitness. History depends on what gets written down, and ancient India presents historians with a famous puzzle. Its civilization produced oceans of philosophy, poetry, law, mathematics, and drama, but far fewer continuous political chronicles than China or the Mediterranean world produced. There are inscriptions, genealogies, and court poems, yet long stretches of the past where we know the ideas far better than the events, which makes one category of source almost priceless. The travelers, outsiders who walked through, took notes, and carried them home. Several such accounts survive, including that of the monk Faxian, who visited India around 400 AD. But the fullest of them, the one that gives Varanasi its first detailed portrait, belongs to a Buddhist monk from China named Xuanzang. His story deserves a film of its own. Born around 602 AD, Xuanzang was a brilliant young monk troubled by the state of Buddhist texts in China. Translations of translations, full of gaps and contradictions. He resolved to go to the source, to India, and read the originals. There was one problem. The Tang Emperor had closed the western frontier. So in 629, Xuanzang left anyway, slipping past border posts at night, nearly dying of thirst in the desert, crossing the snows of Central Asia, and descending, after years of travel, into the plains of India. He was gone 16 years. When he returned in 645, carrying hundreds of manuscripts, the same emperor who had forbidden his journey received him as a national treasure. At the emperor's request, he dictated an account of everything he had seen, the record of the western regions, a country-by-country survey of 7th century Asia. It survives complete, and in it, several pages describe the kingdom of Varanasi. So let us walk through the city of roughly 635 AD with the fullest witness who took notes. He describes the capital stretching along the western bank of the Ganges, densely populated, its lanes narrow and crowded, its people prosperous and cultured, and, he adds, mostly not Buddhist. The majority follow other paths, and the city is dominated by the worship of the god he calls the Great Lord, which is to say Shiva. He counts about 30 Buddhist monasteries with some 3,000 monks, against roughly 100 Hindu temples and, in his telling, 10,000 devotees of Shiva. Those figures are surely rounded. A traveller's arithmetic rather than a census, and it is wise to treat them as impressions of scale. But the proportions are precious. A Buddhist pilgrim, with every reason to flatter his own faith, records honestly that in the city nearest the first sermon, Buddhism had become the minority. He describes a towering image of the god near the river, somber and imposing, whose worshippers practiced austerities with a seriousness that impressed and unsettled him. He describes the ash-smeared ascetics, the crowds at the water, the ceaseless bathing in the river the faithful held to be holy. Across 13 centuries, his snapshot is instantly recognizable. Change the costumes, and much of it could have been taken this morning. Then he goes to Sarnath, and his tone changes to wonder. The deer park, he writes, held a great monastery complex in full glory. He describes a temple soaring, by his measure, some 200 feet, courts and galleries, 1,500 monks in residence, and Ashoka's pillar rising polished and bright, so smooth, he says, that it shone like jade and mirrored the image of the Buddha. Remember, when he visited, that pillar was already nearly 900 years old, an antique of a vanished empire, still standing, still gleaming. Xuanzang was describing the golden autumn of Indian Buddhism, and he did not know it. Within about 6 centuries, nearly everything he saw at Sarnath would be rubble under grass, and the pillar he compared to jade would end up in fragments. Why does this one visitor matter so much? Because he converts our story, for one moment, from reconstruction into testimony. Every earlier chapter of this history has been assembled from scripture, legend, and archaeology, each with its own distortions. Xuanzang gives us a named man, on a documented journey, writing down street-level observations, and where his account can be tested, archaeology has corroborated important parts of it, above all at Sarnath, where excavation uncovered the monasteries, the great shrine, and the shattered pillar close to where his pages place them. Not every figure he gives can be checked, and no single witness should carry a whole city. But when the trench and the notebook agree, we can finally say not that tradition holds, but that a man stood here and saw it. And his testimony establishes something important for yours about timing. Several of the traits the world now considers essential to Varanasi were already visible 14 centuries ago. A city of Shiva, above all, thick with temples, wealthy from cloth and pilgrims, hosting minority faiths within it, drawing seekers from as far away as China. Already ancient in the eyes of its visitors, already certain of its own permanence. The city he described was not the city of today. no 7th century city could be. Sees recognizably the same institution, running the same business, on the same bank. It could not see what was coming. Xuanzang had entered India from the northwest, through the mountain passes. In the centuries after his visit, armies would come through those same passes, and this time they would not be coming to study. The age of the broken temples was approaching, and the eternal city was about to learn what it costs to be famous. Chapter 6. The Broken Temples. Every long-lived city eventually meets a storm it cannot simply absorb. Varanasi had been conquered many times before the 12th century. Mauryas, Shungas, Guptas, and after them dynasties with names like Maukari and Gurjara, Pratihara and Gahadavala had all held the city in turn. But those conquerors, whatever their wars, broadly shared the religious world of the conquered. A new king might favor Vishnu over Shiva, or Buddhist monasteries over Brahmin schools. But the sanctity of the riverbank itself was common ground. What arrived at the end of the 12th century was different. The new conquerors came from a different religious and political tradition, one in which the great temples of a defeated kingdom could be seen both as houses of idolatry and as symbols of a fallen dynasty's power, and in either reading, as legitimate targets. The background is quickly drawn. Through the 11th and 12th centuries, Turkic Muslim dynasties based in Afghanistan pushed repeatedly into northern India. First came raiders, most famously Mahmud of Ghazni, whose expeditions struck deep into the subcontinent in the early 11th century. Then came conquerors who stayed. In 1192, Muhammad of Ghor defeated a coalition of Hindu kings at the Second Battle of Tarain, north of Delhi, and the door to the Ganges plain swung open. At that time, Varanasi was a jewel of the Gahadavala dynasty, whose kings had made the region their power base and were generous patrons of its temples. In 1194, according to the Persian chronicles of the conquerors, a Ghurid army defeated the Gahadavala king Jayachandra and took the city. The chronicler Hassan Nizami, writing to glorify the victors, records that temples were destroyed in great numbers, their idols broken, their treasures carried off. Court chroniclers of that age exaggerated destruction as eagerly as court poets elsewhere exaggerated construction, because in their framework, breaking idols was itself a boast of piety. So the numbers deserve suspicion. But the larger picture has hard evidence behind it. No major temple built before this conquest remains standing intact in Varanasi today. A city that had been raising shrines for well over 1,000 years enters the 13th century. As far as surviving architecture goes, almost empty-handed, honesty requires one more sentence. We cannot assign every loss to that single campaign. Later demolitions, floods, decay, and the endless reuse of building stone all took their share. What the conquest marks is a major break in the pattern. Large, openly endowed. Monumental temple building on this riverbank became far more vulnerable and far more intermittent. And it would be centuries before it recovered. Sarnath appears to have been devastated in this same era of conquest and never recovered. The monasteries Xuanzang, described in their glory, fell to ruin. Their communities scattered, and Buddhism, already fading across India, ceased to function as a major institutional presence in the region of its first sermon. Grass grew over the mounds. Villagers quarried the ancient bricks. The site would sleep for some 600 years, until a very different empire began digging it up, and we will come to that. For the city itself, the 13th through 17th centuries were an age of survival under the Delhi Sultanate and its successor powers. And this is where our story needs balance as much as honesty. It was not one long, unbroken persecution. The record, patchy as it is, shows cycles. Temples were rebuilt in quieter decades, sometimes with the tacit consent of governors who valued the pilgrim economy. Then a stricter ruler would order demolitions again, and the chronicles record such orders under several sultans. The city's sacred life adapted by going small and going inward. Shrines moved into courtyards and private houses. Great images gave way to modest ones that could be hidden or, if broken, remade. And the practices themselves, the bathing, the cremations, the recitation, kept surviving and resurfacing across the period. The surviving record cannot document every year, and this story will not pretend it can. But it was in these hard centuries that the city proved the principle we set out in Chapter 1. Pressed down, it kept coming back up. Something else happened in these centuries that is just as important, and it is too often left out of tellings of this story. Varanasi became home to a large and permanent Muslim population. Soldiers, administrators, artisans, traders, and converts settled in the city. Sufi teachers established themselves, and their shrines became places of local pilgrimage in their own right. And within the city's textile world, there took shape, through processes historians can only partly reconstruct, migration, conversion, and the organization of craft communities, a population of Muslim weavers whose descendants and successors would carry the silk of Varanasi into the modern age. Hold that thread. Centuries later, it becomes one of the most moving facts about this city. And out of this mixed, bruised, stubborn medieval Varanasi came one of the great voices of Indian religion. In the 15th century, by tradition, there lived here a weaver named Kabir. Later traditions commonly remember him as raised in a Muslim weaving household. And his verses, blunt, dazzling, and fearless, mocked the pretensions of Hindu priest and Muslim cleric alike, insisting that the divine was found in neither temple nor mosque, but within. Almost everything about his life is legend layered on legend, and scholars treat the biographies cautiously. The poems themselves are the evidence that matters. They are still sung across India, and he is claimed today by Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs alike. It is hard to imagine any city producing him except this one, where all these worlds ground against each other daily, in the lanes between the loom and the river. So by the year 1600, the city presents a paradox, politically subject for 4 centuries, architecturally stripped of its ancient monuments, and yet spiritually undefeated, economically resilient, more religiously complex than ever, and still, in the eyes of the Hindu world, the center of the earth. The stones had proven breakable. The idea had not. The next century would test that idea under two Mughal emperors whose reigns pulled the city in opposite directions. One would let Kashi rebuild in the open. The other would take a hammer to its holiest place. Chapter 7. Two Emperors. One Sacred City. In 1526, a new power seized northern India, the Mughals, descendants of Central Asian conquerors, would rule the subcontinent for over 3 centuries and give it some of its most famous monuments, including the Taj Mahal for Varanasi. The Mughal age brought both its brightest opening in 400 years and its most famous wound, and the two are forever attached to two names: Akbar and Aurangzeb. Akbar, who reigned from 1556 to 1605, was one of the more unusual rulers of his century anywhere on earth. He was, let us be clear, an emperor and a conqueror, and his policies shifted across a long reign. But in many important areas of imperial policy, he chose accommodation with the Hindu majority he ruled. He abolished the jizya, the tax on non-Muslims. He brought Hindu nobles into the highest ranks of his government. He married into Rajput royal houses, and he hosted debates between scholars of every faith he could find: Hindus, Muslims, Jains, Zoroastrians, and Portuguese Jesuits, listening late into the night. For Varanasi, this climate meant permission to build in the open again. In Akbar's era, the city saw its most significant wave of temple construction since the Ghurid conquest. Most consequentially, tradition and later accounts credit the rebuilding of the Temple of Vishwanath, the shrine of Shiva as Lord of the universe and the heart of the city's sacred geography, to this period. Associating the work with the imperial finance minister Todar Mal and the great Brahmin scholar Narayana Bhatta, the precise details of that patronage are better attested in tradition than in surviving imperial documents, and historians note the difference. What is not in doubt is the larger change. Temples rose again in stone. Pilgrimage swelled. The Pandit schools flourished openly. European travelers began arriving too, and their letters describe a thronged, prosperous, intensely religious city. The English merchant Ralph Fitch, visiting in the 1580s, described Benares as a great town on the Ganges where multitudes came to wash in the holy water. Kashi, it seemed, had outlasted the storm. Then the pendulum swung back, and it swung with a hammer. Aurangzeb seized the Mughal throne in 1658 after a war of succession in which he imprisoned his father and defeated his brothers. He was austere, formidably capable, and far more rigid in religious policy than his great-grandfather Akbar had been. He reimposed the jizya, and his reign is remembered, above all in northern India, for the destruction of several of Hinduism's most prominent temples. Historians studying his long rule add real nuance to the portrait, noting that his record toward Hindu institutions was not uniform, that his administration also issued orders protecting or endowing certain temples and priests in other contexts, and that his demolitions often carried political messages, punishing regions and patrons associated with resistance. The nuance is real. It does not soften what happened here. For Varanasi, the decisive year was 1669. The Mughal court chronicle Masir-i Alamgiri records that in that year the emperor ordered the demolition of the Vishwanath Temple, the very shrine rebuilt in Akbar's era barely a century before, and that the order was carried out. Within the site of the former temple complex there rose a mosque, known today as the Gyanvapi Mosque, and its structure visibly incorporates remains of the older building, a rear wall of carved stone that observers have noted for centuries. That physical detail is not polemic. It is simply there, in the masonry, where anyone can see it. Why did Aurangzeb do it? The Chronicle presents it as an act of faith. Many modern historians read it also as an act of power, noting that it followed unrest in the region and struck at a shrine patronized by families the empire had reason to distrust. Religious zeal, political punishment, imperial theatre. The motives are debated to this day and were probably never separable. What can be said is this: the Imperial Chronicle provides strong contemporary support for the order and the demolition, the motives, and the precise architectural sequence that followed remain matters of interpretation. We need to pause here, as carefully as we can, because this is not safely buried history. The Gyanvapi site is, at this moment, among the most contested pieces of ground in India. In recent years, petitioners have gone to court over rights of worship there. Surveys have been conducted and disputed, and litigation continues. This video will return to that story near its end, with dates attached, and will report what the courts have actually said rather than what anyone wishes they had said. For now, the point is simpler. In 1669, an emperor believed he could subtract a temple from the center of Kashi. More than 3.5 centuries later, the argument over that act is still in progress. That is how long memory runs beside this river. Yet step back from that one terrible year, and the larger picture of Mughal-era Varanasi refuses to be simple. Even under Aurangzeb, the city as a whole was not erased, and its pilgrimage did not end. The silk industry, increasingly worked by the city's Muslim weavers, prospered on courtly demand, and it is one of history's quieter ironies that the fabric of Hindu ceremony was being perfected under Mughal patronage by Muslim hands. Hindu merchants and bankers grew wealthy on the river trade. Scholars kept producing texts. The city bent, absorbed, endured, as it had for 500 years. And history was preparing one of its great reversals. Aurangzeb's endless wars exhausted his empire. Within decades of his death in 1707, Mughal power was crumbling, and into the vacuum rose new powers. Among them, a confederacy of Hindu warriors and statesmen from Western India, the Marathas. They saw themselves, in part, as restorers of what had been broken, and when their eyes turned to Kashi, they did not merely rebuild a temple. They rebuilt, in stone, most of the city the world now photographs. The eternal city was about to receive its current face. It is younger than you think, and the next chapter is where it is born. Chapter 8. The Marathas rebuild the eternal city. Here is the chapter where this story keeps the promise it made you at the beginning. We told you the eternal city is younger than you think. Now we can show you how young, and name the people who built it. As Mughal power collapsed in the early 1700s, the Maratha Confederacy rose out of Western India to become the dominant power of the subcontinent. The Marathas were Hindu warriors, administrators, and bankers, and many of their leaders carried a specific, deliberate vision. They saw themselves as restorers. In their letters and treaties, one demand appears again and again. The sacred cities of the north, Kashi among them, must be protected and rebuilt. They never fully ruled the Varanasi region. Politically, the city in this century passed from the fading Mughals to the Nawabs of Awadh, and then, increasingly under a rising local dynasty, the Rajas of Benares, founded by a landholder named Mansa Ram and made powerful by his son Balwant Singh. The map, in other words, was complicated, but money and devotion do not need to hold the map. Through the 18th century and into the 19th, Maratha rulers, generals, and noble families poured wealth into Varanasi on a scale the city had not seen in 1,000 years. And stairway by stairway, temple by temple, they built most of the riverfront the world now photographs. Understand what the Ghats actually are, because the word is about to matter. A Ghat is a flight of stone steps descending into the river, often crowned with platforms, shrines, and towers. Before this century, much of the city's riverbank was earthen slopes and modest constructions, repeatedly wrecked by the monsoon flood. The 18th and 19th centuries turned that soft edge into architecture. Much of the monumental stone riverfront you see today took shape under Maratha patronage beginning in this era, with repairs, extensions, and rebuilding continuing ever since. Dashashwamed Ghat, the busiest stage of the city's ritual life, owes major construction in the 1740s to the Peshwa Balaji Baji Rao. Sindhya Ghat and Ahilya Ghat carry the names of the Maratha houses that paid for them. Panchganga Ghat was renewed. The stone observatory above Man Mandir Ghat, first built by the Rajput king Man Singh in the Mughal era, was refitted with astronomical instruments in 1737 by Jai Singh II of Jaipur, the same king who built the famous observatories of Jaipur and Delhi. When you look at photographs of Varanasi's waterfront, that long amphitheatre of stone, you are looking mostly at the 18th and 19th centuries, standing on ground far older than anything visible in the frame. And then there is the Queen. Ahilyabai Holkar ruled the Maratha state of Indore for nearly 30 years, from 1767 to 1795. Widowed young, she took power in an age when female sovereigns anywhere remained exceptional. And she governed, by the account of contemporaries and later historians alike, with unusual administrative skill and unusual conscience. Even European observers, writing about a rival power, described her rule with open admiration. And she spent her fortune on one project above all. Across the length of India, from the far south to the Himalayas, she financed temples, rest houses, wells, and ghats at dozens of sacred sites. Her most famous act came around 1780 at Varanasi, on ground beside the mosque that stood within the site of the old temple complex. Ahilyabai Holkar built the Vishwanath Temple anew, not on the original platform, which the mosque occupied, but immediately adjacent, so close that the two structures have stood almost wall by wall ever since. That building, her building, is in its essentials the Kashi Vishwanath Temple that pilgrims enter today. Repaired and altered across the years, but hers, in origin, pours on the date, 1780, while her masons worked on the other side of the world. The American Revolution was still being fought. The holiest shrine of the holiest city of the Hindu world, a faith with roots 3,000 years deep, was built after the American Declaration of Independence was signed. In the 1830s, the Sikh Maharaja Ranjit Singh, ruler of Punjab, crowned the work with a gift of gold large enough to plate the temple's spires, which is why it is known as the Golden Temple of Varanasi. A Maratha queen built it. A Sikh king gilded it. The city, as always, was assembled by everyone. Step back and take in what this century means for our story. For 500 years, this city's sanctity had lived mostly in memory, in small shrines. In the stubborn return of pilgrims to a scarred riverbank, the 18th century poured that memory back into stone. What we call the timeless Varanasi skyline is, in truth, a restoration project, an act of will by people who had read what was lost and decided to answer it. The Eternal City is not a place that never changed. It is a place that refused to stay erased. But every restoration has a bill, and the money that rebuilt Kashi was flowing through a world that was changing hands. Even as Ahilya's masons worked, agents of a foreign trading company were signing treaties a few miles away. In 1775, 5 years before her temple rose, the Nawab of Awadh transferred the Benares region to the East India Company. The new landlords of the Eternal City were merchants from London. What that meant, no one on the riverbank yet understood. They were about to find out. Chapter 9. Benares under the Union Jack. The East India Company did not take Benares by storming its walls. Its power had been won in wars elsewhere, in Bengal and beyond. And it arrived here in the form conquest takes when the fighting has already been decided somewhere else. Treaties, revenue claims, and paperwork. In 1775, the company acquired the rights to the Benares region from the Nawab of Awadh. The local Raja, Shay Singh, remained on his seat, now paying his revenue to a corporation with shareholders in London and an army in Bengal. It looked, at first, like just another change of overlord in a city that had seen dozens. 6 years later, the city showed its new masters what it thought of them, and the scene deserves to be played in full. The year is 1781. The company is bleeding money in wars across India. And its Governor-General, Warren Hastings, the most powerful man in British India, comes to Benares in person to squeeze extra war funds from Chet Singh. The Raja pleads poverty. Hastings, in the Raja's own city, orders him placed under arrest. Word runs through the lanes. By afternoon, crowds and the Raja's armed men converge on the house where their ruler is held. And in the fighting that follows, they kill much of the small company detachment guarding him. Chet Singh escapes down the palace wall by a rope of turbans. So the story goes, and flees across the river and Warren Hastings, ruler of an empire in the making, finds himself trapped in a hostile, holy city with a handful of guards, writing letters he is not sure will get through, waiting to learn whether he will leave Benares alive. Relief columns reached him. The rebellion was crushed within weeks. A more pliable relative was installed as Raja, and the affair became evidence in the impeachment proceedings against Hastings that later transfixed the British Parliament for years. But note the pattern, because it will return. This city does not rise often. When it does, empires remember. What followed was a century and a half of a strange double life, in which Benares, as the British called it, became simultaneously more colonial and more intensely itself. The colonial layer is easy to see. The Company, and after 1858, the British Crown, ruled through the Rajas of Benares, whose palace still stands across the river at Ramnagar. A cantonment, courts, railways, and bridges arrived. The city was mapped, taxed, censused, and photographed. Missionaries came, and judging by their own often frustrated reports, achieved far less than they had hoped in a city where the alternative was 3,000 years old and standing at the end of the street. And British scholarship, with its peculiar mixture of curiosity and condescension, began uncovering the region's buried past. In 1794, workmen quarrying an old mound at Sarnath for building materials broke into a relic chamber, and attention slowly turned to the ruins. Through the following decades, surveyors and archaeologists, Alexander Cunningham foremost among them, excavated the monasteries, the great shrine, and eventually the shattered lion pillar that Xuanzang had compared to jade 12 centuries before. The site's identity, as the place described in the Buddhist texts, had faded outside limited scholarly and local memory. Its monuments, long quarried and overgrown, excavation brought it back into the light of the wider world. Pilgrims from Ceylon, Burma, Tibet, and beyond began returning. And Sarnath today is once again one of the great pilgrimage destinations of the Buddhist world. It is a complicated inheritance, an empire's archaeologists recovering what earlier conquests had broken. And this story owes accuracy to both halves of that sentence. At the same time, and partly by British design, the city's Sanskrit heart kept beating. In 1791, the company's resident, Jonathan Duncan, founded the Benares Sanskrit College, the first government-sponsored institution of its kind, intended to train pandits and codify Hindu law for colonial courts. The pandit households continued alongside it, and Benares, in the 19th century, remained what it had long been, a certifying capital of Sanskrit learning, now with a printing press attached. And the river kept drawing the world. This is the century when Varanasi entered the Western imagination through engravings, photographs, and travelers' books, and we will give that subject a chapter of its own, because the image the West built still shapes what you expected this video to be. But the most consequential thing the British era gave this city was, ironically, an instrument of their own departure. Indian nationalism needed institutions, and Benares built a great one. The campaign was led by Madan Mohan Malaviya, a scholar and Congress leader, with crucial early support from Annie Besant, the Irish theosophist and Indian Home Rule campaigner whose Central Hindu College became the seed of the project. In 1916, Benares Hindu University opened south of the city, and it grew into one of the largest residential universities in Asia. Its opening ceremonies produced one of the great scenes of modern Indian history. February 1916. The Viceroy of India is present. Ranks of bejeweled Maharajas fill the platform, and among the invited speakers rises a slight lawyer in plain dress, recently returned from South Africa, still largely unknown to most of India. His name is Mohandas Gandhi, looking out at the princes in their diamonds. He says that India's salvation will not come from such display while millions live in poverty, and that self-government will be won by farmers and labourers rather than by ornamented elites. Dignitaries object. Some walk out. The session dissolves in uproar, and the organisers are mortified. It was one of Gandhi's first major public provocations on Indian soil, a preview of the next 30 years. And it happened here, in the city of Kashi, at a university built to marry ancient learning to a modern nation. Through the following decades, the university and the city fed the independence movement with students, scholarship, and stubbornness, protests, boycotts, arrests, the gentler descendants of 1781. And when independence came at midnight on the 15th of August, 1947, the princely state of Benares acceded to the new Indian Union. 2 years later, in 1949, it was merged into the province that became the state of Uttar Pradesh. And in January 1950, India adopted its constitution and became a republic. On official maps, the city carried its ancient name, Varanasi, Kashi to the faithful, as it had been all along. For the first time in centuries, the city belonged to an independent Indian state. What modern India would do with its eternal city, and what the eternal city would do to modern India, is the story of everything that remains. But first, we owe a debt. We have mentioned the engravings, the photographs, and the imagination of the outside world. It is time to look at all of it directly, because the Varanasi in your head, before you pressed play, was probably built by it. Chapter 10. The Varanasi in your head. Before we go on with the city's own story, we need to talk about the Varanasi that exists in the Western mind. If you grew up in America or Europe, you may well have carried an image of this place before you ever searched for it. Smoke over the river, crowds in the water, a city of death and mystics. Where did that image come from? It has a history of its own, and it says as much about the West as it does about the city. Start with the early travelers. European merchants and missionaries had described Benares since the 1500s, but the image hardened in the 19th century. When the city became a fixed station on the imperial tourist circuit, painters and then photographers found in the riverfront something Europe felt it had lost: an ancient religion still fully alive. And they framed it the way the age framed most things Eastern, as a spectacle, sublime, teeming, unknowable. The word most often reached for was timeless. And notice what that word does. It is a compliment that quietly removes a place from history. A timeless city has no politics, no economy, no change, no argument. We have just spent 9 chapters proving that few cities on earth have more history than this one. The Western gaze, with real admiration, wrapped Varanasi in a word that erased all of it. Mark Twain is the most interesting witness precisely because he was too good a writer to stay inside the frame. He came in 1896. On the World Lecture Tour, he undertook to pay off his debts, and wrote up Benares in his book Following the Equator. He joked that the city was so thick with holiness that there was hardly room to move. And he was frank, sometimes unfairly so, about the dirt and the crowding, but he also sat with the city long enough to be genuinely moved. And out came the sentence that has been quoted ever since. Benares, he wrote, is older than history, older than tradition, older even than legend, and looks twice as old as all of them put together. Read those chapters today, and you can watch a skeptical American mind wrestling with something his categories could not hold. He mocked, he marveled, and he left more honest confusion on the page than most travelers left certainty. That confusion was, in its way, a form of respect. The 20th century added a new layer. After Indian independence, and especially from the 1960s onward, the West stopped sending mostly administrators and started sending seekers. This is the era when Indian spirituality broke into Western popular culture on a large scale. And the most famous single moment came in 1968, when the Beatles traveled to India to study transcendental meditation with the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. Let us be precise, because precision matters on this channel. Their retreat was at Rishikesh, far upstream on the Ganges, in the Himalayan foothills, not at Varanasi, and the two places are often carelessly blurred together. But the effect did not stay in Rishikesh. The most famous band on earth helped make gurus, meditation, and the imagery of the Ganges newly visible in Western living rooms. And in the decades that followed, the trail of Western seekers, backpackers, and burned-out professionals made Varanasi one of its principal stations, because Varanasi was the most photographed, most written about, most intense city on the river. So the city acquired its modern Western reputations, layered one on top of another. The open-air museum of religion, the backpacker rite of passage, the place you go to watch cremations, a subject that deserves and will get its own chapter next. The film set for stories seeking instant profundity, and, more recently, the bucket list destination, the city that appears on lists of places to see before you die, usually with a drone shot at dawn and a caption about timelessness. The word never went away. What did the city itself make of all this? Mostly, it did what it has done with every arriving power and every arriving audience. It absorbed them and put them to work. The gaze became an industry. Boatmen, gid, guest houses, silk shops, yoga schools, photography tours. Varanasi learned to sell the very image the West had made of it, sometimes cheerfully, sometimes wearily. And an economy long sustained by pilgrims simply added a new kind of pilgrim, one carrying a camera instead of an offering. But here is the point of this chapter, the thing we most want you to carry out of it. The Western image is not false. The smoke is real. The crowds are real. The intensity is real. The image is incomplete, and incomplete in a specific direction. It keeps the ritual and drops the city. It shows you the bathing crowds and not the university with its tens of thousands of students. It shows you the burning ghat and not the silk workshops, the railway junction, the traffic, the municipal elections. It offers you a city of the dead, when the truth in front of the camera is a modern Indian city of well over 1 million people, counting the urban area around it, for whom the sacred is woven into an entirely ordinary working day. The most striking thing about Varanasi, seen clearly, is how unexotic its holiness is to the people who live inside it. A man finishes his riverside prayer and checks his phone. Both acts are the city. Keep that correction in mind as we walk into the next chapter, because now we go to the one subject where the Western gaze and the city's own self-understanding stare at each other most directly, and where the gap between spectacle and meaning is widest. We are going to the burning ghats, and we are going to try to see them not as a camera sees them, but as the city does. Chapter 11. The City of a Good Death. The guidebooks will tell you that people come to Varanasi to die. Strip away the sensational tone, and a real fact remains. Some people do come here, deliberately, near the end of life, and their families bring them, and the city has built institutions to receive them. To understand why, you have to take seriously an idea we planted back in chapter 4. When the Puranas were writing the city's guarantee into scripture, the promise is called Kashi Moksha. In the traditions that shaped this city, the soul is bound to samsara, the cycle of death and rebirth, driven by karma, and the deepest goal of existence is moksha, liberation from the cycle altogether. Liberation is understood to be extraordinarily difficult, the work of countless lifetimes, with, in the influential traditions of Kashi itself, one great exception: die within the sacred zone of this city. And Shiva himself, it is said, whispers the liberating teaching into the ear of the dying, and the soul crosses over, free, not a better rebirth, no rebirth. Hinduism is a vast family of traditions, and not every school reads death in Kashi the same way. But for centuries, this promise has been strong enough that people have organized their lives around it, and their deaths. Take the belief seriously, and the city's entire relationship with death follows logically. This is why the old and the gravely ill have long traveled here to wait. Varanasi contains institutions built around this specifically Kashi-centered promise. Unusual even within India. The best known, Kashi Lab Mukti Bhavan, has operated since 1958, offering simple rooms where a dying person and their family may stay, traditionally for about 2 weeks, with priests to chant and staff to help, at little or no cost. Its longtime manager, Bhairav Nath Shukla, became known to Indian and foreign journalists for his reflections on what a working life spent among the dying had taught him. Picture what a room there actually holds, because journalists who have visited describe scenes that stay with them. A cot, a single bulb, A window. On the cot, an old man from a village 300 miles away who told his family, sometime in the last month, that he wanted to finish here. Beside him, a son who has taken unpaid leave and does not know how long this will take. And a daughter-in-law cooking on a small stove in the corner because the house provides shelter and chanting, not meals. In the courtyard, a priest recites down the lane, motorbikes, shop radios, ordinary afternoon noise. Sometimes the wait ends in days. Sometimes the 2 weeks pass and the family must gently be asked to go home, because someone else is waiting for the room. And sometimes the old man asks to be carried to the window, so he can hear the river. For many of the families in those rooms, the mood is not despair. Arriving in Kashi is understood not as defeat, but as the completion of a journey, the successful end of a plan made carefully in advance. And this is why the cremation grounds stand at the center of the city rather than its edge. We opened this entire video with that fact. And now you have the context to feel its weight. Across most of the world, and across most of India too, cremation grounds are kept outside the town, ritually set apart, avoided. Varanasi inverted the rule. Manikarnika Ghat, the principal burning ghat, occupies some of the most prominent riverfront in the city, beside temples, oms, and shops. A short distance south, Harishchandra Ghat burns as well, named for a legendary king remembered for serving at a cremation ground as the ultimate test of truthfulness. Tradition holds that the sacred fire at Manikarnika has been kept alive continuously for thousands of years, passed from pyre to pyre. No one can document a claim of that age. And this story will not pretend otherwise. What can be said with confidence is simpler and still astonishing. Cremations here continue around the clock, every day of the year, and they number many thousands annually. Published estimates of the daily count vary widely, and the city has only recently begun building comprehensive registration at the Ghats. So we will not offer you a false precision. The smoke you see in every photograph is not an event. It is the city's permanent weather. Now meet the people who keep that fire, because their story carries one of the sharpest ironies in this whole history. The cremation grounds are worked by a community known as the Doms. In the traditional caste hierarchy, their hereditary occupation, handling the dead, placed them at the very bottom, among those once branded untouchable. Yet ritual custom at Manikarnika gives them an extraordinary position. By long tradition, the flame used to light a pyre there is taken from the fire kept by the Doms, and their hereditary leader, titled the Dom Raja, the king of the Doms, presides over it. Families of every caste, including the highest, come in their hardest hour to receive fire from the community, their social order placed lowest. The paradox cuts in both directions. A Dom Raja has at times been a man of real wealth and public honor. And in 2019, a serving Dom Raja was among the citizens who formally proposed the sitting Prime Minister's election nomination in Varanasi. And at the same time, reporting by Indian and international journalists has documented that many ordinary workers of the burning Ghats remain poor, that the labor is harsh, and that the old stigma has not disappeared. Both things are true at once: sanctity and inequality, burning on the same fire. What does a cremation here look like? In the sequence most commonly described, and with respect for the families involved, the body, wrapped in cloth, often bright with marigolds, is carried through the lanes on a bamboo bier by relatives chanting that the name of God is truth. It is dipped in the Ganges, then laid on a pyre of weighed and purchased wood. The chief mourner, traditionally the eldest son, his head newly shaved, circles the pyre and applies the fire. The burning takes hours, attended, unhurried. Afterward, the ashes go to the river. Rituals differ by family, region, and community, and no two funerals are identical. Observers often note an emphasis on restraint at the pyre. Grief held inside ritual form, though composure should never be mistaken for the absence of sorrow. Visitors may watch from a respectful distance and are asked, by custom and simple decency, not to photograph. Many who watch report that it permanently changed how they think about death. Precisely because nothing is hidden, many industrialized funeral systems place layers of physical distance between mourners and the reality of cremation. Varanasi removes the distance. In the middle of town, in daylight, and calls the result auspicious. There is one more turn to this chapter, and it matters. The same river that receives the dead also serves the living. Their bathing, their drinking water, their livelihoods. The environmental cost of everything a city of more than 1 million people sends into a sacred river has become one of modern India's defining struggles. And we are saving it for our final chapter, where it belongs, because it is a story about the future. For, now, hold the central image, a city that put death in its front window and, by doing so, made it part of the daily traffic of life. The lesson locals repeat to visitors is simple. Here, death is not the opposite of life. It is one of its neighbors, and a civilization that can live calmly beside that neighbor has something to teach every civilization that cannot. Next, we turn from the fire to the loom, and to the community we have been following in the background since the medieval chapters, the weavers of Varanasi, and what the modern world is doing to them. Chapter 12. The Weaver's Lament. We have carried a thread through this entire story. The ancient reputation of Kashi cloth in the age of the Buddha, the pit loom in the classical workshop, the weaving communities of the medieval centuries, within which, through migration, conversion, and the slow organization of craft, a largely Muslim weaving population took shape. The Mughal courts, whose patronage helped raise the craft toward its full splendor. It is time to pull that thread into the present, because it leads to one of the most surprising facts about the holiest city of the Hindu world, and to one of its quietest griefs. Here is the fact. Varanasi is not, and has not been for many centuries, a purely Hindu city. Census figures in recent decades indicate that Muslims make up roughly 1/4 to 1/3 of the city's population, one of the larger urban Muslim communities in northern India. And for generations upon generations, the economic backbone of much of that community has been the loom. Neighborhoods like Madanpura and Lalapura have hummed with weaving for as long as anyone's family memory reaches. By government and press estimates, hundreds of thousands of people in and around Varanasi have depended on the sari industry, and Muslim weaving families, many of them of the Ansari community, form a large and often dominant share of the handloom workforce. The craft lives inside households, fathers and sons at the looms, women preparing yarn, finishing, and embroidering, whole families organized around the work. Now hold the two halves of this picture together, because this is the point. The Banarasi silk sari is not just a luxury product. It is ritual equipment for Hindu life. In much of northern India, and in Indian families across America and Britain, a wedding without Banarasi silk is hard to imagine. Brides are married in it. Temple images are clothed in it. Families save for years to buy one and pass it down as inheritance, which means that for centuries, at the emotional center of countless Hindu weddings, there has been an object made largely by Muslim hands. In the city of Shiva, call it what it is, one of the most tangible forms of interdependence between the two communities anywhere in India. Kabir, the weaver poet of chapter 6, would have recognized it instantly. His city's looms went on preaching his sermon long after he was gone. What does the work itself involve? A true handloom Banarasi sari, with its dense silk and its patterns of gold and silver thread called zari, its motifs of paisley and vine and Mughal floral design, can take weeks or months to complete. 2 or 3 weavers may work a single loom in shifts. In the workshops that use the jacquard system, introduced during the colonial era, the pattern is punched, hole by hole, into cards that guide the loom. And a master weaver reads those cards the way a musician reads a score. It is worth pausing to note that punched card looms of this family occupy an honored place in the prehistory of computing, a lineage historians of technology trace with care. The finished sari can sell for anywhere from a modest sum to the price of a car, depending on the silk, the zari, and the reputation of the workshop. And that world is in trouble. The lament in this chapter's title is not decoration, beginning especially in the 1990s and 2000s. The handloom economy of Varanasi absorbed a series of blows it has never fully recovered from. Power looms first. Mechanized looms, many operating in and around the city itself, can produce in a day an imitation of what a handloom produces in a month, at a fraction of the price. Then came floods of cheap machine-made imitations, produced both domestically and abroad, undercutting the genuine article in its own markets. Add rising silk prices, exploitative middlemen, and changing tastes, as lighter, cheaper garments pulled everyday buyers away from heavy brocade. Reporting by Indian newspapers and studies by craft organizations through the 2000s and 2010s described the results starkly. Workshops closing, master weavers sending their sons to drive rickshaws or cut hair rather than take up the loom. Wages for ordinary weavers falling to levels reporters repeatedly found shocking for work of such skill. The worst years brought documented hardship and hunger in the weaving quarters. And the community itself speaks of that period with pain. Efforts to save the craft exist, and they are not nothing. In 2009, Banarasi brocades and saris received geographical indication status, a legal registration meaning that, in principle and under the terms of that registration, only products actually made in the defined region may be sold under the Banarasi name within India. Enforcement is another matter, and imitations remain widespread. Government schemes have promoted handloom marks, weaver welfare programs, and a large trade facilitation center opened in Varanasi in the 2010s. Designers in Mumbai and Delhi periodically return Banarasi weaves to the runway, and a genuine high-end market survives, sustained by wealthy Indian families and by the diaspora. Ordering wedding saris across an ocean, some workshops now sell directly online to customers in New Jersey and London and Toronto. Whether all this amounts to a rescue or a managed decline is honestly disputed, and probably will not be settled for another generation. But be clear about what is at stake, because it is more than economics. Every craft this old is a library. The motifs preserve Mughal garden design. The techniques preserve centuries of textile knowledge. The workshop preserves a way of passing mastery from hand to hand that no school can replicate. When a master weaver dies without a successor, a shelf of that library burns. Varanasi has already lost its ancient buildings once in this story. Its intangible inheritance, the skills and the rituals, is now the oldest thing it owns. And there is one more layer, the one this chapter has been building toward. In a country where relations between Hindus and Muslims have grown more strained in recent decades, the weaving economy of Varanasi has stood as one of the oldest working examples of daily interdependence. Hindu traders and Muslim weavers, Hindu buyers and Muslim makers, bound together by the sari. People in the city often say, with pride, that this interdependence has helped Varanasi hold together where some other Indian cities have fractured. Historians would add the honest footnote, the city has known communal tension and episodes of violence too, and no economy makes a city immune. But the larger observation stands, and it is worth stating plainly. In this city, for centuries, the two communities have needed each other, visibly, materially, at every wedding. Weaken the loom, and you do not just lose a craft, you thin one of the oldest threads holding the city together. That thought is the doorway to our next chapter, because in 2014, this ancient, layered, delicately balanced city walked into the center of Indian national politics. And in the years that followed, its sacred heart was rebuilt on a scale not seen since Ahilyabai, while in the courts, the city's oldest wound returned to the headlines. That story now, told carefully, because it is still being written. Chapter 13. The Prime Minister's Holy City. In the spring of 2014, Narendra Modi, then the Chief Minister of Gujarat and the opposition candidate for Prime Minister of India, filed his nomination papers to stand for Parliament from Varanasi. Indian members of Parliament each represent a geographic constituency, and a national leader's choice of seat is a statement. Modi's statement was unmistakable. He told the crowds that he had not come on his own, that Mother Ganga had called him. He won the seat, and with it the prime ministership, in 2014. He won Varanasi again in 2019. and again in 2024, though with a sharply reduced margin in that last contest, a detail worth remembering because it tells you this city votes with its own mind. Why Varanasi? Observers across the political spectrum describe the logic in similar terms. Modi's party, the Bharatiya Janata Party, places Hindu cultural identity at the center of its politics. And no address in India carries more Hindu symbolic weight than Kashi. Representing Varanasi, joins the leader to the civilization's holiest city. It also anchored his campaigns in Uttar Pradesh, India's most populous state and its greatest electoral prize, a seat, a symbol, and a strategy, all in one. What followed was the largest transformation of the city's sacred core in 2.5 centuries. In 2019, construction began on the Kashi Vishwanath corridor, a project personally championed by the Prime Minister. The idea was simple to state. For generations, the Vishwanath Temple had been buried in the dense old city, reachable only through narrow, crowded lanes, cut off from the river it faces. The corridor cleared and rebuilt a broad connection from the temple precinct down to the Ghats, with plazas, pilgrim facilities, museums, and security infrastructure. It opened in December 2021, and official statements afterward reported visitor numbers rising into the tens of millions per year. Figures that count visits rather than distinct individuals, and that deserve to be read with that in mind. What any camera can confirm is that the temple precinct now moves crowds on a scale the old lanes never could. The price of that clarity is where the story divides. And we will give you both sides as fairly as we can. To build the corridor, according to reporting by Indian and international outlets, roughly 300 properties in the lanes between temple and river were acquired and demolished, displacing hundreds of families and businesses from one of the city's oldest and most densely layered inhabited quarters. Supporters point out that owners were compensated, many at rates well above market, that the quarter was decrepit and hazardous, and that dozens of old shrines hidden inside private houses were uncovered and restored during the clearance. Critics, including heritage scholars and displaced residents quoted in the press, mourned the loss of a living historic fabric, argued that what makes Varanasi itself is precisely the layered maze, and warned that the Sacred Heart was being remade into something closer to a modern religious complex than an ancient city. Both descriptions reflect genuine and well-documented perspectives. Which persuades you depends on what you believe a holy city is for: continuity of stones or capacity for pilgrims. Varanasi faced that same question under the Marathas, and answered for the pilgrims then too. And beside the gleaming new corridor stands the oldest wound. Remember 1669, the Gyanvapi Mosque, raised after Aurangzeb's demolition of the Vishwanath Temple, still stands beside Ahilyabai's replacement, wall by wall. During these same years, litigation brought by private Hindu petitioners returned the site to the center of national attention. The petitioners sought rights to worship within the mosque compound, arguing that Hindu deities and temple remains exist inside. Courts ordered surveys. A filmed survey in 2022 found a stone object that petitioners describe as a Shiva lingam, and the mosque committee describes as part of a fountain, and that single disputed object became a national controversy. In 2023, a court permitted a scientific survey by the Archaeological Survey of India, and the ASI report subsequently provided to the parties concluded that a large Hindu temple had existed at the site before the mosque. The Mosque Committee contests the survey's methods and its conclusions, and the report is evidence in ongoing proceedings, not a final judicial finding. In early 2024, a district court permitted Hindu prayers to resume in one cellar of the mosque compound, and the mosque itself continues to function as a mosque. Appeals and related petitions have remained before the courts, including India's Supreme Court, and this remains live litigation at the time of this recording. So treat what you hear here as the state of a story still moving, and check the latest reporting for where it stands today. The country's memory shadows every headline about Gyanvapi. At Ayodhya, a few hundred miles away, a 16th century mosque stood at a site many Hindus revere as the birthplace of the god Rama. In 1992, a mob demolished that mosque, setting off deadly riots across the country. Decades of litigation followed, and in 2019, India's Supreme Court awarded the disputed site for the construction of a Hindu temple, while directing that land be provided elsewhere for a new mosque. The temple was consecrated in 2024. Ayodhya is why every step at Gyanvapi is watched so closely, by every community, and why the courts move with such deliberation. Step back from the specifics, and you can see what this chapter is really about. Every power that ever held this city used it to say something. The Guptas said classical glory. Aurangzeb said submission. Ahilyabai said restoration. The British said empire and archaeology. And in our own era, many observers see in Varanasi's transformation a piece of a larger argument over how India should balance its constitutional secularism, its Hindu majority identity, and the place of its minorities. That framing is an interpretation, ours and many others, not a settled fact, and thoughtful Indians disagree about it deeply. What is beyond dispute is that the argument is real, that it is unresolved, and that a remarkable share of it is being conducted through this 1 square mile of temples, mosques, courtrooms, and stone. The Eternal City has become, once again, the place where India explains itself to itself. Meanwhile, beneath the politics, the city simply continues. The corridor fills at dawn. The mosque fills on Fridays. The looms, fewer each year, keep time in the weaving quarters. And the river, which has outlasted every argument in this story, is running out of patience of its own. For our final chapter, we go down to the water, where this story began, and ask the only question left. Can the river that made the Eternal City survive the age that inherited it? Chapter 14. The River Remembers. Begin the last chapter where we began the first, at the water's edge. Everything in this story has depended on one physical fact: a river at a bend, flowing north past a high bank. The Ganges made the city, fed it, sanctified it, carried its trade, received its dead. For 3,000 years, the relationship ran mostly one way. The river gave, and the city took. In our lifetime, the direction has reversed. The river now needs the city and the country behind it to save its life. The scale of the problem is not seriously disputed, because Indian government bodies have documented it themselves for decades. The Ganges Basin is home to hundreds of millions of people, and the river receives, along its course, enormous volumes of sewage, much of it untreated or partially treated, along with industrial effluent from tanneries and factories upstream, agricultural runoff, and the remains of ritual life. Monitoring by India's Central Pollution Control Board has repeatedly found stretches of the river, including near Varanasi, where bacteria levels exceed the country's own safe bathing standards many times over. At the very ghats where millions bathe as an act of purification, and where many pilgrims sip the water as a sacrament. The river has often measured unfit for bathing by the government's own criteria. Few people embodied that contradiction more completely than a man this city should remember. Veer Bhadra Mishra held two positions that ought not to fit together. He was a professor of hydraulic engineering at Benares Hindu University, trained to read the data on what the river carried, and he was the hereditary head priest of the Sanskrit Temple, one of the city's most beloved shrines, bound by faith to the Ganges as a goddess. He refused to abandon either identity. In 1982, he founded the Sankat Mochan Foundation, which campaigned for decades to clean the river, monitoring water quality independently, lobbying governments, and pressing for treatment technologies suited to the city's conditions. His work drew international recognition, including selection by Time magazine as one of its heroes of the planet in 1999. He died in 2013. With his river still sick, what he left behind was the question this chapter cannot escape. A city can worship a river and poison it at the same time. Reverence, by itself, is not protection. Governments have tried, in waves. The Ganga Action Plan, launched in 1986 under Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi, built treatment plants and spent large sums, and is widely judged by Indian auditors and scholars to have fallen far short. In 2014, the new government, its Prime Minister now representing Varanasi itself, launched Namami Gange, the mission to salute the Ganges, with a budget in the billions of dollars, aimed at sewage treatment, riverfront management, industrial regulation, and biodiversity. A decade on, the honest verdict is mixed, and honest reporting says so. New treatment plants operate in Varanasi and along the river, and official monitoring reports genuine improvement in some stretches. At the same time, independent scientists and the government's own data continue to record severe bacterial contamination at many points, including during the great festival gatherings. While sewage generation races ahead of treatment capacity as the cities grow, the fairest single sentence may be this: the river is being fought for, seriously, for the first time in its modern history, and the fight is not yet being won. Climate change has entered the story too. The Gangotri Glacier, one of the river's Himalayan sources, has been measurably retreating for decades, according to Indian and international glaciology. That retreat matters. though it is only one part of a much larger hydrological picture that also includes shifting monsoons, heavy groundwater extraction across the plain, and rising demand from agriculture and cities. Varanasi has known record floods that drowned the ghats and forced cremations up into the lanes, and seasons of alarming low water that exposed wide flats of sand. The city that was placed on a high bank precisely to negotiate with the river's moods now watches those moods grow harder to predict. And yet, go down to the ghats tomorrow at first light, and none of what we just described will be visible in the behavior of the city. The bells will start in the dark. An old woman will fold her hands at the waterline the way her grandmother taught her. The first bathers will descend the steps in the cold, cup the water, and lift it to the rising sun. Inside a ritual tradition renewed again and again across centuries, whose exact continuity no historian can fully reconstruct and no conqueror ever managed to end. The evening fire ceremony at Dashashwamedh will draw its nightly crowd of pilgrims, tourists, and boats. The pyres at Manikarnika will be burning. They were burning while you watched this video. So let us keep the promise we made at the beginning and say plainly what we have learned. The eternal city is not eternal in the way the postcards mean. Much of the monumental riverfront in the photographs took shape in the 18th and 19th centuries. Its holiest temple was built by a queen around 1780. After the American Declaration of Independence was signed, it has carried several names: Kashi, Varanasi, Benares, Benares, overlapping across languages, faiths, and administration. Its people have been conquered, taxed, demolished, displaced, and rebuilt by Hindus, Buddhists, sultans, Mughals, Marathas, Briton, and republics. Everything made of stone here has proven mortal. What has endured is something no one ever built: an agreement, renewed one human being at a time, morning after morning, that this bend of this river is worth standing beside. Kings could not create that agreement, and conquerors could not cancel it. It survived the broken temples, and the censuses, and the cameras, but the threat now takes a form this city has never faced before. Not whether Varanasi survives, but whether the river can go on supporting the practices built around it. For 3,000 years the city kept coming back to the water. The water is now waiting to learn whether devotion can become protection. Mark Twain looked at this place and saw something older than history. We have spent this whole journey discovering that he was wrong in the letter and right in the spirit. The city is not older than history. The city is history, all of it, layer upon layer, still arguing, still weaving, still burning, still bathing, still becoming. And tomorrow, in the dark, before dawn, someone will walk down the old stone steps to the water and begin it all again. Thank you for making this journey with us. If a moment of it stays with you, the queen who rebuilt a temple, the pilgrim who walked from China, the weavers at their looms, then the city has done what it has always done. It has made one more person stop beside the river. Tell us in the comments which city you would like to walk through next. Until then, may your own river run clean.